People often compare the British Empire and the Roman Empire. They were both huge and powerful. They both ruled over many different lands and peoples. Rome controlled much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for centuries. The British Empire at its peak was even larger. It was so big that people said, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." Both empires built roads, created laws, and left behind impressive buildings. But when we look closer, we see a darker side. We must ask a serious question. Which empire was worse for the people it ruled? Was the British Empire, with its modern technology and global reach, more harmful than ancient Rome? The answer is not a simple one, but the evidence points in one clear direction. Both empires believed they were superior to the people they conquered. The Romans saw others as barbarians. They believed their mission was to bring civilization and order to the world. Similarly, the British believed in their own superiority. They spoke of the white man's burden, a supposed duty to civilize the so-called backward peoples of the world. This idea was used to justify their rule. They saw themselves as bringing progress, but this progress often came at a terrible cost to the local populations. This shared belief in their own greatness was the foundation for many of their cruelest actions. The Romans were masters of control, often through direct and brutal force. They used their powerful legions to conquer lands and crush any rebellion without mercy. When a city resisted, Rome would make an example of it. The destruction of Carthage is a famous example. After defeating their rival, the Romans completely destroyed the city and its people. For those who submitted, Rome offered a path to citizenship. This was a clever strategy. It gave some conquered people a stake in the empire's success. However, the Romans also relied heavily on slavery. They captured millions of people and forced them to work in mines, on farms, and in homes, building the wealth of Rome on the backs of enslaved labor. The British Empire also used violence, but its methods of control were often more systematic and economic. They perfected the strategy of divide and rule. They would find existing tensions between different ethnic or religious groups in a colony and make them worse. By setting groups against each other, they made it harder for the local people to unite and resist British rule. This policy created deep divisions that have lasted long after the empire ended, leading to civil wars and genocides, such as the partition of India in 1947. When it comes to exploitation, the British were ruthlessly efficient. They did not just take resources, they destroyed entire industries to benefit themselves. For example, India was once a world leader in textile manufacturing, but the British systematically dismantled this industry. They imposed high taxes on Indian textiles and flooded the market with cheap, mass-produced cloth from factories in Britain. This act of economic vandalism destroyed the livelihoods of millions of Indian weavers and turned India from a manufacturing powerhouse into a poor supplier of raw cotton for British mills. This was not just trade, it was deliberate deindustrialization. The difference in technology between the two empires is a crucial factor. The Romans had swords, spears, and catapults. Their ability to project power was limited by the speed of a ship or a marching army. Communication took weeks or months to cross the empire. This meant that Roman control, while brutal, was often less total. Governors in distant provinces had a lot of autonomy, and local cultures could sometimes survive in the gaps of Roman power. The British Empire, on the other hand, existed during the Industrial Revolution and beyond. They had the steamship, the telegraph, and the machine gun. The steamship allowed them to move troops and administrators around the world with incredible speed. The telegraph meant that an official in London could send an order to a governor in India or Africa and have it arrive in hours, not months. The machine gun gave small groups of British soldiers a massive advantage over much larger native forces. This technological superiority made British conquest easier and their control far more absolute. This technological power led to violence on an unimaginable scale. The Romans could be cruel, but the British committed atrocities with industrial efficiency. During the Boer War, the British created concentration camps where thousands of women and children died from disease and starvation. The famines in India, especially the Bengal famine of 1943, were not just natural disasters. They were made worse by British policies that prioritized exporting food for the war effort over feeding the local population. Millions starved to death while food was shipped out of their country, a tragedy enabled by modern logistics. Furthermore, the British assault on culture was more profound. The Romans often incorporated local gods into their own pantheon. They were generally tolerant of local religions as long as the emperor was also worshipped. The British, driven by a strong sense of Christian missionary zeal, were far more destructive. They saw native cultures as heathen and savage. They imposed their own language, religion, and education systems, actively trying to erase local traditions. Lord Macaulay's infamous Minute on Indian Education explicitly aimed to create a class of Indians who were Indian in blood and color but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This was cultural destruction on a grand, systematic scale. The end of an empire is as important as its life. When the Roman Empire fell in the West, it left behind a chaotic power vacuum. However, it also left a unifying legacy of law, language, and the idea of a shared European identity. The Latin language evolved into modern Romance languages like French, Spanish, and Italian. Roman law became the foundation for many modern legal systems. While its fall was violent, the cultural and legal structures it left behind were adapted and used by the successor states. In some ways, the idea of Rome never truly died, it just transformed into the foundation of Western civilization. It left building blocks for the future. The legacy of the British Empire is far more problematic. When the British left their colonies, they did not leave behind a unified foundation. Instead, they left behind chaos and conflict born from their policies. The artificial borders they drew across Africa and the Middle East lumped together rival ethnic groups and separated communities that had lived together for centuries. This has been a direct cause of countless civil wars, ethnic cleansing, and political instability that continue to this day. The partition of India, which created India and Pakistan, resulted in the deaths of up to 2 million people and displaced over 15 million. This was not a legacy of unity, it was a legacy of division. Economically, the scars are just as deep. The British did not build up their colonies to be self-sufficient. They structured them to be dependent on Britain. They extracted raw materials and sold back expensive manufactured goods, a system that prevented local industrial growth. When independence came, these new nations were left with unbalanced economies, little industry, and a population that had been systematically impoverished. The wealth of Britain was built upon the poverty of its empire. This global economic inequality, the gap between the developed First World and the developing Third World, is perhaps the most enduring and harmful legacy of British imperialism. In conclusion, while both empires were brutal and exploitative, the British Empire was worse. Its advanced technology allowed for control and violence on a greater scale. Its economic exploitation was more systematic and deliberately designed to create dependency. Most importantly, its legacy is one of division, poverty, and instability that continues to plague the modern world. The Romans were conquerors in an ancient world, limited by ancient means. The British were conquerors in a modern world, and they used all the tools of modernity to enforce their will, leaving behind a more damaged planet. The sun may have set on the British Empire, but the darkness it left behind still lingers.